Good morning. Today we're going to talk about another type of good that requires public intervention, that free markets will not provide the correct amount. I hope you have picked up from these last lectures that I'm a real gung-ho supporter of competition. We really do love free markets when they can operate, but there's a whole wide swath of situations in which they don't operate appropriately. And so being always free market oriented is a mistake. Being always government interventionist is a mistake. You got to figure out on a case-by-case basis what's the best thing to do. So public goods is the type of good we're going to talk about today. We want to find out what they are, what's socially optimal, and then how to get there, what a market would do without government intervention. So far in this class, we've been talking about types of goods that are private goods, and the defining characteristic of them, for today's lecture at least, is that consumption of the good by one person precludes consumption of the same good by another person. So if you're renting an apartment, that means another person doesn't get to rent the apartment. If you're eating an apple, you're eating it and somebody else can't eat it. So it's considered exclusive. Consumption is exclusive. One person consuming the good prevents another person from consuming the same good. Public goods are distinguished by the fact that consumption is not exclusive. That consumption by one person does not prevent consumption of the exact same good by another person. So as always, what are examples of this? One example that's very important is national defense. The defense system that protects me protects everybody else. We don't need our own, each of us need our own defense department. So we're all protected by the same thing. Fire departments, the fire department that protects my house protects your house also. We don't each have to have our own fire departments. What are other examples? What? Street lights, exactly. In fact, streets are public goods because the ability to move around on the streets that they provide to one person doesn't preclude another person from also having that option. That's an interesting example in which a public good can become private when there's congestion such that one person on the street prevents another person from getting on that same road. Then it becomes a private good. So it can switch from being a public good to a private good depending on circumstance. That actually raises another good example. National parks, all parks, are generally public goods. Yosemite is available for all of us to use. We don't each have our own Yosemite. But that also is one in which you can switch from being a public good to a private good. How many of you have gone backpacking in the North Country in Yosemite and you have to get those permits? Yeah. You have to get a permit to go backpacking, and there's a limit on how many permits there are. And so when the permits have been used up, one person getting a permit prevents another person from actually going backpacking. So in a sense, the backpacking country, when the permits are fully utilized, becomes a private good. One more person means one less other person gets to use it. But until you get to that point of congestion, then it's a public good. One person using it doesn't prevent another person. Other examples. TV. You're watching a TV show, does it affect anybody else who's watching it? They can watch the same TV show. That's a very good example of a class of goods, intellectual property goods. Nearly all intellectual property is a public good. Books, for example. The content of the book is a public good. You're reading War and Peace and getting the enjoyment from it doesn't prevent another person from reading it. The actual physical book in which the content is contained is a private good, because if one person has the physical book, then another person doesn't have that same physical book. But the content of the book, something other than just the pieces of paper, is a public good. That's true also for songs, electronic songs. You're listening to a song, does it prevent another person from listening to it? Apps, how many of you have created a computer app to sell on? Yeah. Did you make any money? A little bit. Apps are public goods. because after you've created it, one person using it doesn't prevent another person from using it. The problem there, of course, is, and that's what we're going to talk about, is how do you get reimbursed for this? There was another hand up. Yeah. What? Sidewalks. Exactly. Another example where one person using it doesn't prevent another. So the first question always is, what is the socially optimal outcome? And then what would a market do? And then how do we intervene if the market doesn't provide what's socially optimal? So let's go back and look again at what is socially optimal for private good, and we can realize just from analogy how it works for public good. Remember, for private goods, we want to produce until the price of a good is equal to the marginal cost. What this does is mean that anyone who's willing to pay more than the price or more, buys the good, and as a result, we always produce an extra unit when anyone's willingness to pay for the good is greater than the marginal cost. So in this setup, each person buys if their willingness to pay is greater than the price, and we only produce if marginal cost is less than or equal to that price. And so that gives us as the result that we always produce whenever anyone in the society has a marginal willingness to pay for an extra unit that's greater than marginal cost. And that's what we should do. We should always produce an extra unit when someone's willing to pay more for it than it costs to produce it, in terms of giving up other goods and services. So now applying that to a public good, with a private good, we talk about that for each individual person. Each person's willingness to pay has to be greater than the the marginal cost for their unit, because they're each buying that unit. But with a public good, everyone's consuming the good simultaneously. So it doesn't make sense to say one person's willingness to pay for the good, because we're all buying it together, essentially. We're all consuming it together. So just as a notational device, it's a little bit sloppy notation, let PI be the willingness to pay that person I has for the good. It might be better instead of P to put willingness to pay, but it's kind of like the price they would be willing to pay for the good. Social optimality for a public good occurs when the sum of willingness to pay over all people in the economy is equal to the marginal cost. Or stated in a slightly different way, whenever the amount that people are willing to pay in total for the public good is greater than the cost of the public good, or an extra unit of the public good, then we should provide more of the public good, and we should stop when there's that total amount willingness to pay is equal to marginal cost. Because if we go beyond that, the marginal cost will go higher, willingness to pay goes lower, and we'll provide an extra unit where the cost is greater than the total willingness to pay. So all we've done is essentially substitute our old criterion, which operates on each individual person, because each person's buying one good, to all of us combined, because we're all collectively buying the good. So this is very clear what's socially optimal. The problem is how to get that. I'm going to have an example that's kind of ongoing here of, let's consider buying an acre of parkland in Berkeley. So there's a vacant lot available and we could buy it. And the question is, how much should we do it from a social perspective? So the procedure that you would want to go through is to ask each person, what is their willingness to pay? I'm willing to pay $10, Roberto's willing to pay $15, Clara's willing to pay $13. You add it up over all the people in Berkeley and get the total willingness to pay for that. And if the cost of it is less than that, then we go ahead and buy it. It's a very straightforward criterion. The problem is, though, the procedure that I just described for how you would determine whether to provide this good, even though you can think about it in a theoretical sense of this is what you would want to do, when you actually try to apply that procedure, it's going to fail. Why? Because nobody wants to reveal their willingness to pay. This is kind of a prisoner's dilemma. Each person will correctly recognize that their willingness to pay is probably not going to be the deciding element. For example, I would easily see that if I just say that my willingness to pay is 0 instead of 10, the total amount that everyone is willing to pay combined is going to go down only by 10, and I recognize that. And I would think that $10 is not going to make a difference on whether the total willingness to pay exceeds the price. You're never going to be that close to the exactness on the two. And so for me, I have an incentive to lie about my willingness to pay. I figure the land will be bought anyway, and if I say my willingness to pay is 0, then I don't have to pay for it. Because remember, the process was you ask each person their willingness to pay, buy the land if the willingness to pay is greater than the cost, and then charge each person for their willingness to pay for the land. You got to come up with the money, and that's how you come up with it. But each person in this situation will recognize that they are better off by misreporting their own willingness to pay, saying their willingness to pay is 0, because that way they get the parkland and don't have to pay for it. Of course, then everyone will do this, and we won't get the parkland, because the sum of marginal willingness to pay from everyone, when you ask everyone, will be 0. Everyone will say, no, I don't care. And you won't get the parkland. This is a prisoner's dilemma writ large. And again, there's no way out of it. If you then think, well, we all have to respond honestly to be able to get the right amount of parkland and pay up our fair share of how much we're willing to pay. So you think that, and you say, okay, I'm going to report my willingness to pay, I'm going to trust everyone else to. As soon as you realize, oh, I'm going to trust everyone else to, then you realize, well, then I don't have to. So there's no way out. So the basic procedure that you would like to apply that kind of mimics the social optimality condition is simply infeasible. The approach that has been used in most situations is to apply user fees. And this I'm going to describe, is also going to not be effective and provide too little of the public good. This would be an example of where you have to pay a fee to go into Yosemite. There were, back in the old days, fire departments were supported through fees for the individual homeowner. And if you didn't pay your fee, the fire department wouldn't protect you. And there were actually instances in history, this happened actually recently down on the peninsula someplace, where the fire trucks simply wouldn't go to a house that was burning up because it hadn't paid its assessment for the fire department. This is a case in which you try to charge fees for it. The logic behind this is, well, if people are willing to pay enough for the cost, then we can charge them for that willingness to pay and pay for the public good. I mean, the logic seems intuitively reasonable. However, it's not reasonable, and it will end up failing to give the optimal amount of public good. There's two reasons. First of all, anyone whose willingness to pay is less than the fee will not obtain the public good. So if you put a fee on going into a park, actually they're doing this in San Francisco. The San Francisco Arboretum, they're charging $6 fee to now go in. I find it infuriating. Anyway, anyone who's not willing to pay $6 to go in will not get the enjoyment of being in the Arboretum, okay? And so that's a loss to society for which there is no gain anywhere. There's no trade-off here. Since an extra person can go into the Arboretum without hurting anyone, without using any resources, nothing's lost. There should never be the case where a person whose willingness to pay is greater than 0 is denied entrance. It's just a loss of welfare. So these people whose willingness to pay, my pointer's gone out of juice. So people who are willing to pay a positive amount but less than the fee, less than $6 to go to the Arboretum, won't use the public good, and that in itself is a loss that's not made up anywhere else. And that means we're at a social optimality, a loss of social optimality right there. But the other problem is that even the revenues that we get will not be enough to count, it will be considerably less than the total willingness to pay of all people. And it's because you lose on both sides of the equation. Anyone who's willing to pay less than the fee, you don't get any revenue from them because they don't go into the Arboretum or wherever. Okay? And anyone who's willing to pay more than the fee, you only get the fee. So you never get the total amount of willingness to pay. The most you can get is going to be less than willingness to pay, and if you only buy the public good when the amount that you can extract in fees exceeds the cost of providing the public good, then you're going to provide too little of the public good. You're not going to be buying as much as you should because you're not extracting the full willingness to pay. Okay. So here's my example again. If we charged let's just say us, the top three here, the total willingness to pay for us is $38. If you charge $10, we'd all enter, but you'd only get $30 in fees instead of $38. And if the land costs $36, you'd decide not to buy it then. If you said, okay, well, that's not enough, let's charge $12, then, because $12 is a third of the cost of the land, then I wouldn't go, and all you'd get is $28. So there's no way to set a fee that will actually extract the full willingness to pay. And as a result, since you're always getting less than the full willingness to pay as a fee, if you only provide the public good when the total fees you get exceeds the cost, then you won't be getting enough public good. This was one of the arguments used against the ballpark. Remember there was, when the ballpark was being built in San Francisco, there was all this argument about whether the government should subsidize it or not. And the argument was you should be able to charge people to go into the ballpark, and if you can't make enough money from that, you shouldn't build it. Now, you can decide for yourself whether you think a ballpark is a public good or not. Obviously, it is a public good as long as all the seats aren't full. But that kind of logic is something that's very appealing, but it misses the idea that you're always going to lose on both sides. Those who aren't willing to pay the fee, you don't get anything from. Those who are willing to pay more, you're getting less than the full amount. So you end up with the popular conclusion that too few public goods are provided. This is the general result of, if you try to provide this through a market mechanism, charging people for the good. And the fee concept, I want to step back on this. The fee concept is actually applied in different forms for different kinds of public goods. For example, a book. The content of the book is a public good, and yet when only physical books could be read before the electronic age, you had to buy the physical copy. And so what was happening there is that the price of the physical copy was used to finance the public good, and the author got some royalty. So it's essentially a fee also, because the royalty to the author becomes just a little bit that's added to the price and paid to the author. There's no cost associated with it because the author's already finished writing the book. And so that's the same thing. And it ends up that, essentially you get too few authors being supported because you can't correctly obtain the full surplus. And your app, how much money did, whoa, Mr. Cow, how much money did you make on your app? $25. Do you think it's worth more than that to the public? I bet you do. This is the problem with apps. It's exactly the same thing. You put it out for a fee and you think that should, it's better than not charging anything in the sense that some will get developed. But there's a real need for more development of software and a mechanism for providing remuneration to the developer of the software that compensates for all the time and extracts the full value. Okay. So this is a very big issue. There have not been very many good solutions. There is, however, a quite good solution in a particular set of classes, set of circumstances. it's often the case, like for parkland, fire departments, national defense, that you can identify what the good is and then put a ballot proposition before the public asking them whether they want to vote in favor or against paying for this public good. For things like authorship of intellectual property, it's extremely difficult to do this because what are you going to say? Let's vote to subsidize Tolstoy before he's written anything to figure out whether we want to, enjoy his books at later. It's very hard when the public good in intellectual property hasn't yet been produced. But a lot of public goods, you can identify what they are in advance of actually purchasing them. And in those, we can put a ballot proposition. This is, in fact, the way most public goods are decided, either indirectly or directly through ballot propositions. What I want to show here is that there are circumstances under which a ballot proposition will actually produce what's socially optimal. And so it's a way of not having a market intervention, but government, through the ballot proposition and taxation, provide the public good. So for example, with the three of us, with me, Roberto, and Clara, where total willingness to pay is 38. Let's say the land cost 36, and so we put a ballot proposition on the ballot, a proposition on the ballot. We will buy this acre, make it into a park, and we will divide the costs among each person. Each person will pay $12. What's going to happen in this case? Each of us will vote depending on whether we're willing to pay more than the amount that is being assessed in taxation. So I will vote against it. Roberto and Clara will vote in favor of it, and it'll pass. So this situation where if we had asked each person how much they're willing to pay, they would have all said 0, and so you wouldn't buy it. If you charge a user fee, you couldn't possibly have gotten $36 in user fee. There's no way to set a user fee that'll get you the $36. So those two mechanisms would fail, but the ballot proposition does succeed in providing what is indeed socially optimal. Given that it's desirable from a social perspective to buy the land, you can, in this situation, have a ballot proposition that succeeds and provides that socially optimal amount. You should be asking yourself, did he just cook that example? Or does this have any generality to it? And the answer is yes, there's generality, but it might not be as wide as you would like. So we wanted to specify exactly under what conditions a ballot proposition will bring about what's socially optimal and when will it not. Okay? So that's what we're going to do for the remainder here. So suppose that we have a public good and the total willingness to pay for it is greater than the cost. So from a social perspective, we should purchase it. What we want to know now is under what conditions will a ballot proposition actually pass to bring about that socially optimal amount, and when will it fail? The next sentence is the key element that determines when it will pass and when it will fail. A ballot proposition will pass for this socially optimal amount of the good as long as the median willingness to pay is equal to the average willingness to pay. Okay, somebody tell me what's the difference between median and average? Hang on. Anyone else? Okay, go ahead. The median is where half the people are on one side, half the people on the other side. So median means there's 50% above and 50% below. You got one person right in the middle. And average is like if you drew the whole distribution, it's the balance point. It's the point where if you could kind of like visually balance the distribution, that's where you would balance it, which is not necessarily the center. For a bell-shaped distribution, like a normal distribution, the median and the mean are the same. Why do we care about the median willingness to pay? Because in a ballot proposition with majority rule, whatever the median voter does the person with the median willingness to pay does, that's what's going to determine whether the ballot passes or not. If the person with the median willingness to pay votes in favor of it, everyone with a higher willingness to pay is also going to vote in favor, and so it will have 50% plus 1. If that person votes against it, everyone with a lower willingness to pay will also vote against it, and it will lose because you'll get 50% plus 1 against it. So the median voter, this is very interesting. It comes down to our, essentially all of us are irrelevant in the ballot except that one person who is at the median, who has the median willingness to pay. Half the people have a higher willingness to pay, half the people have a lower willingness to pay. That person's vote is the one that determines the outcome. Now, there could be some people, well, never mind. So what we want to know is, what will that median person do? What is the person with the median willingness to pay going to do in response to this ballot proposition? Here's the proof of what I've just shown you. It's a little, you should try to get the intuition of this, not just the steps, but we start out with total willingness to pay is greater than total cost. That's because we're assuming that this is a good we want to provide from a social perspective. So let's say this is just a statement that we want this provided from a social perspective. Now the question is, will the ballot actually provide it? Well, total willingness to pay divided by the number of people is the average willingness to pay. So you just divide by the total number of people in the economy. Total cost divided by the number of people is the average cost. Now, one thing you should note here, this is average cost defined differently than you normally have done it. Average cost for private goods is the total cost of providing the good divided by the number of units that are being sold. But here we're just selling a public good in general. There's one unit, like a park or whatever. Here we're dividing by the total number of people who will be consuming the good. So we're not dividing by the number of units, with each unit being bought by a separate person. We're dividing by the number of people who will be utilizing the good, who will be consuming the good. So this is, you could think of this perhaps better, you might put in parentheses in your notes, cost per person. That's what it is. So the ballot proposition is then going to say, should we buy this land and each person pay the cost per person, the average cost? That's the ballot proposition. Now, if the median willingness to pay is equal to the average willingness to pay, then this is equal to that, and we just substitute it. And then the median willingness to pay is greater than the cost per person, and so the median person will vote in favor of it. The median person will say, my willingness to pay is greater than what I'm being assessed as my per person cost of the good, and so I will vote in favor of it. The median person will vote yes. Everyone who has a higher willingness to pay will vote yes, and it will pass. Now, there might actually be some people that have a lower willingness to pay who will also vote in favor. But that doesn't matter because we've already passed with just having the median person vote in favor. So this shows that when the median willingness to pay is equal to the average willingness to pay, a ballot proposition will provide the socially optimal amount. This is a useful device. This is very, very important. This is a way we can think about how to use ballot propositions and when to put them on. So when does this happen? Well, like I said earlier, if you have a distribution of willingness to pay, this is like the number of people, this is the number of people that have each willingness to pay, and this is the value of the willingness to pay. There's a few people that have a very low willingness to pay. There's a few people that have a high willingness to pay. Most people are grouped at the middle. If you have a symmetric distribution like this, then the average willingness to pay is going to be equal to the median willingness to pay, and a ballot proposition will operate effectively. So when would it fail? Well, we got two possibilities. Either the average is greater than the median, or the average is less than the median. That's the only possibility. So we know already that it's going to pass as long as the median and average are the same. Now we want to look at the two other possibilities where they're not the same in opposite directions. So suppose we have a distribution that's shaped like this. It's skewed off to the side. So half of the distribution is above this and half is below, but the balance point, the average, is right here. Any of y'all have taken statistics, this is like a log normal distribution. We're skewed over. The average of a log normal is higher than the median. But essentially any distribution that's skewed. What this is a situation where most people aren't willing to pay a whole lot, but there's some people out here that are willing to pay a huge amount for this good. What's an example that this might be? A public good in which most people are willing to pay just, a little amount for it, but some people, a small minority, is willing to pay a huge amount for it. Yeah. A seawall on a cliff, perfect, where the rich people's houses are right close to it, and everyone else could really care less if the seawall protects the area, or not very much, don't care a lot. Opera, whether to build an opera house or not. Any other examples? So what's going to happen in this situation? In this situation, a good that should be provided from a socially optimal perspective will not be provided through a ballot proposition. Suppose the cost of the good is just equal to the total willingness to pay, or just slightly less. That means that the average willingness to pay is going to be equal to the average per person cost of the good. So you could put in your notes here, average willingness to pay equals, it's not equal definitionally, but it's also for a socially optimal good, for the social optimal quantity, it's going to be the per person cost of the good. So the ballot proposition is, do you want this public good and each person pay this amount right here? The median person will vote against it because their willingness to pay is less than the amount they're going to be assessed. And everyone who has a lower willingness to pay is also going to vote against it because they have a, are willing to pay even less. These people in here are also going to vote against it, but we don't really care about them because as long as we know the median person's voting against it, we know what the outcome is. So when you have a distribution of willingness to pay that's skewed like this, a ballot proposition will provide too little of the public good. We're going to have too few opera houses. What was the other example over here? Seawalls, too few seawalls from the use of ballot propositions. What would you want to do in this situation to try to remedy the situation, try to help? In the ballot propositions that I've been proposing, you take the total cost of the good, divided by the number of people, and assess each person their per person cost of the good. In many situations, you can actually obtain a better sense of what people's willingness to pay is and charge them somewhat according to their willingness to pay. You can't ask each person what their willingness to pay is because each person will give you zero. But in a case like a seawall, you could probably guess pretty accurately that the people along the seawall with houses there are willing to pay a lot more than everyone else. So instead of dividing the cost equally among all people, you can divide it in a way that tries to place the highest cost on those people that you would think have the highest willingness to pay. So a seawall, you would charge the people along the seawall a disproportionate share and everyone else less. That would have a better chance of passing. The more in which you can then assess the closer you can get to assessing each person their willingness to pay without asking them, you're never going to be able to do it without perfectly, but the closer you can get to that, the closer you're going to get to a ballot proposition passing when it should pass. The seawall is a great example of that. Then you have the opposite situation, where the distribution is skewed in the opposite way. In this situation, the average willingness to pay for the socially optimal amount of the good is equal to the per person cost, and so the ballot proposition would be, should we provide this good and charge each person this amount? The median person is now above that and will vote in favor of it, and and it will pass. So the socially optimal amount will pass in this case, But notice that even more than the socially optimal amount. What if we have a good that costs more than the average willingness to pay? It's right here between the average and the median. That good should not be produced because average willingness to pay is less than the average cost of the good, the per person cost. And yet the median willingness to pay is greater than it, and it will pass. So in this case, when you have a skewed distribution in this direction, there's going to be a tendency for ballot propositions to provide too much of the public good. So at least unlike user fees and the direct approach of asking people, both of which will end up with too little of the public good, ballot propositions can end up with the correct amount of the public good if the distribution is symmetric. If it's skewed one direction, too little of it. If it's skewed the other direction, too much. And both of those problems can be solved partially by trying to allocate the costs of the good more closely to the willingness to pay of each person. Yeah. That was what I was just going to ask. I've given this lecture several times. I have yet to come up with a decent example of a good that has this distribution. Can anyone think of one where there's a few people that are willing to pay practically nothing, but the biggest number of people are willing to pay more than the good actually costs? Yeah. What is it? Diamonds? Well, diamonds aren't public goods, are they? Because you wear it on your ring, somebody else can't use it. But that's a good idea that it's, well, let's see. Yeah. Actually, that's right. You could have that because this is behavioral economics. This is field of economics. It's kind of bringing psychological aspects into the realm. There is a general tendency among human beings to overemphasize risky things, to worry about small probability events and overemphasize them. It might be for national defense that most of us are willing to pay more than the average cost of it. Of it, and there's only a few people out there that are kind of rational about it, that you're not really willing to pay too much, and we end up with a overabundance. Actually, that's a failure of a different kind. I think that's well, maybe not. That's the best example I've ever heard. So yeah. Anyway, this is the way to think about things. You can always put it on a ballot proposition, and you want to get the payment that each person makes as closely aligned to their willingness to pay as possible without asking them, because they would not reveal it. That raises the remaining question: why do people reveal their willingness to pay in a ballot proposition when if you ask them about it, they won't reveal their willingness to pay? How did we get out of the prisoner's dilemma? The reason is, if you ask a person their willingness to pay and then charge them that amount, their revelation of how much they're willing to pay becomes the amount that they have to pay. So there's a tie between their response and how much they're going to pay. In a ballot proposition, you have to pay the amount that's assessed in the ballot, no matter what happens. If it passes, you have to pay. If it doesn't pass, you don't pay. All you can do to affect how much you pay is vote in favor of it or against it. And you will always want it if the good provides you more benefit than what you're having to pay. So it's breaking the link between your response and how much you're having to pay. Everyone has to pay whatever the assessed amount is, no matter how they voted. So the vote is not tied, each person's vote is not tied to how much they're having to pay. A ballot proposition that would lose is everyone who votes for the ballot has to pay for it, and those who didn't vote in favor of it don't have to pay for it. That would be back to the prisoner's dilemma. So it's the fact that the amount each person pays is unrelated to their revelation, their statement of what their willingness to pay is, in this case, whether it's more or less than the assessment, is what breaks the thing. This is very important because in many areas of life where the prisoner's dilemma exists, you want to figure out a way to get out of it. And it usually comes to something like that where you try to break those off-diagonal elements. Okay, anything else? Nope, that's it. See y'all Wednesday.